Before you hear my story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever discovered a truth so painful it shattered everything you believed? Share your answer in the comments because your voice matters. And don't forget to subscribe. This channel is where stories like mine are finally told. The fluorescent light above the nurse's station hummed like a tired insect when the doctor led me to the far corner and lowered his voice so much I could barely hear him over the elevator bell. "He is not who you think he is," he said, and the world pitched as if the floor of St. Helena Memorial on 82nd Street had become a ship. His identity was switched years ago. His real wife and children are outside. I tasted metal. I remember the cold of the wall against my shoulder, the laminated poster about hand hygiene, the smell of disinfectant and chicken soup that someone had spilled on a tray. I remember my mouth trying to form the word no and failing. 40 minutes earlier, I had paid the parking machine $8.20. Slot C27, told the clerk at the gift shop that my husband liked green apples, bought two for $1.60 each, and practiced a smile in the reflection of the elevator doors so he would not see how scared I had been these last few weeks. Pneumonia, they said on Tuesday night. A simple course of antibiotics, they said. We caught it early. Now the doctor was telling me my husband of 14 years had another name, and a life that apparently waited in the hallway like a storm that had been tracking us for years. I felt my voice find itself in pieces. "What do you mean switched?" I asked. He glanced toward the double doors as if something on the other side were listening. "There was a car accident in 2016, he said. Rural clinic outside Akron. 2 men came in without identification. One made it, one did not. They both had similar features. The records were a mess." He looked at me as if asking permission to proceed. "Our records flagged a discrepancy today when we pulled his old imaging. Tattoos did not match what the old chart described. There was a name on the implant registry that did not match his insurance. It triggered a deeper check." He swallowed. "The other family recognized him from a photograph." He said the last sentence quietly, and I thought of the black and white portrait that sits on our hallway shelf, the one we took in Coney Island in 2018, when the boardwalk smelled like fried dough and sunscreen, and he insisted on buying the photographer package for $50 even though we were counting pennies to pay the rent. I said his name, the name I knew, the one on our lease and tax returns. Lucas. The doctor studied me with a pity that made my stomach turn. "That is the name on your records. The other name is Daniel." He did not need to say the last name. My chest filled with a buzzing heat I recognized from the nights I waited for him to text back, and the minutes turned into hours, and I told myself he must have fallen asleep on the sofa at work again. I remembered the first time I saw him, February 2011, a blunt winter with black slush on the corners and a rent special at a walk-up in Washington Heights. I was 26, crossing Audubon Avenue with a paper cup of watery coffee, when the wind ripped the lid away, and he caught it with a clumsy grin. He joked that the city taxed smiles, and I owed him $3. We laughed, and I did not realize how much I needed the sound of my own laughter after working double shifts at the pharmacy on 181st Street. He worked nights at a loading dock near the river. He said he was from Ohio. He said he had never seen the ocean until he was 19. He never talked about his family. I did not push. We were always counted in bills and overtime and the next step. We saved for a used Honda, 2010 Silver Civic with a dented fender, $3,600 in cash that we folded into a plain white envelope and handed to a man named Benito behind a warehouse in Queens. We celebrated with pizza from the place on Broadway that still used paper punch cards. He kept the receipt in his wallet like a talisman. He said it was the first thing he ever bought that made him feel like he was going somewhere. The doctor was still talking. Words like protocols and legal, and we will need to verify, and I said, "I need to see him." He nodded and led me through the door where the hall dimmed and the monitors beeped at irregular intervals like the memory of a song you cannot place. Lucas was asleep, or pretending to be. The bruise on his cheek had spread into the yellow that shows up on day 3 of recovery. The IV hissed. I sat in the blue vinyl chair and the doctor gave me a minute before saying we have to talk about next steps. He meant documents. He meant what name would be on the discharge and who would sign, and whether the insurance company could threaten to claw back payments for the last treatments. My mind pulled a string out of the past, and all the memories gathered along it like laundry on a line. The time we counted quarters on the coffee table in 2014 to pay the electricity because Con Ed had sent a warning. The time he came home in 2017 with a cut on his forehead and said a box had fallen at work, and he did not want to make a fuss. The time he cried on the edge of our bed in 2019 when my mother died, and he said, "Short breath, I wish I knew how to say the right thing." And I told him he already had by being there. The time we almost broke in 2020 when the pandemic emptied the pharmacy shelves and he lost 3 weeks of work, and the landlord threatened to raise the rent to $2,400 by June. We did not break. Or I thought we did not. He opened his eyes then and looked at me in a way I had never seen. There was a distance, a calculation, as if he were trying on my face to see if it still fit. I said quietly, "The doctor told me." He flinched like a boy caught stealing a soda. He touched the tape on his hand where the IV ran. I heard the question that my voice did not want to form. Is there another woman? Are there children? He looked at the ceiling and said a soft word that could have been the beginning of my name or the end of someone else's. Outside the door, I heard footsteps and the scrape of a stroller wheel against the frame. I thought of the savings I had built over 12 years. The blue zippered envelope in the shoebox under the bed with $2,730, the emergency fund we had promised never to touch. I thought of the way he always avoided cameras at office parties, the way he never signed up for the pharmacy family picnic, even when I told him there would be raffle prizes, the way he answered calls in the hallway and returned whispering that it was a customer who needed help with a delivery. I thought of the night last summer when we walked across the bridge at sunset, and he pointed to the river and said, like a confession, "Do you ever feel like everything you are is one wrong name away from falling apart?" The door opened and the doctor nodded to someone. I braced myself for a woman my age with my worries stamped on her face. What I saw was a woman maybe a few years older than me in a cardigan the color of clean rainwater. Her hair pulled back in a practical knot, her eyes red but steady. A boy of 8 stood beside her in a striped hoodie, and a girl around 12 held a sketchbook to her chest. The woman breathed my air, and I felt the world tilt again. She said a name that was not Lucas, and the man in the bed flinched. She did not cross the threshold. She kept her hands at her sides as if they might betray her. The boy whispered "Daddy," and the word flashed like a match in the dim room. The girl pressed the sketchbook harder. The woman looked at me without hate, which was somehow worse. I said, "I am his wife," and heard how thin it sounded under the buzz of the light. The doctor lifted his hands gently and said, "We are going to take this one step at a time." I thought of the summer of 2015 when we saved to visit Niagara Falls, and then gave the money to his friend who said he needed to make rent. $700 in cash. We ate freezer pizza that weekend and laughed at a bad movie, and I told myself generosity returns in circles. I thought of the February when our heater died, and he found a space heater on Craigslist for $40, and we pretended it was camping. I thought of all the names I had called him in my head during fights, and all the names he might be carrying that had nothing to do with me. I heard my own breathing turn audible. I asked her what is his birthday, and she answered May 2nd, 1983, and I felt the date hit the center of me because I had baked a chocolate cake every year on June 8th. And wondered why he always looked a little surprised when I sang. He had told me June because we met in June because June was the month that made sense for who we were. The girl opened her sketchbook and showed a pencil drawing of a man sitting on a porch with a dog at his feet. It was him at a different angle. The porch was not ours. The dog we had never owned. The doctor said there was a mistake years ago, and it fell on all of us, and for a foolish second I wanted to believe in accidents, in paper-cut errors that can be taped and forgiven. But accidents do not tuck children in or open college savings accounts or learn the names of the pharmacists who smile at the counter on Sunday mornings. Accidents do not smell like a specific detergent when they climb into bed. Accidents do not reach for your hand in the dark at 3:09 because a dream reminded them of something they swore to forget. I looked at the woman and then at him and asked a question that surprised me with its calm. "How long did you know?" He closed his eyes. She answered for him in a voice that sounded like someone who had fought to keep anger from turning into poison. "We thought you were dead," she said. "After the accident, the hospital called me. They said they had lost a man and found a man, and the one I loved was gone. There was a funeral without a body. The pastor said words I cannot remember. Then months later, a call about an implant registry with a serial number that matched a surgery he had before we met. That was 2 weeks ago." The boy shifted closer to the bed. The girl kept drawing lines in the air over the man as if editing him back into place. My throat tightened until I thought I might pass out. 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, I had made soup and paid the Con Ed bill online and asked him if he needed new socks and told him not to drink coffee on an empty stomach. In those 2 weeks, someone else had been told that the ground was spinning back under their feet. I realized something cold and practical even as my heart thrashed. If the name on the lease was wrong and the insurance was under a person who might not exist, and the taxes had been filed with a signature that might be floating in some legal limbo, then everything we had built could be argued into silence. The doctor said again, "We will take this one step at a time," and I wondered how steps work when the floor itself is not the floor you thought. The boy finally spoke loud enough for the room. "Can I touch his hand?" The woman nodded. He reached for the fingers I had held through flu and grief and rent notices. The man in the bed turned toward the boy instinctively. There was no performance in that movement. There was a tenderness I had trusted and suddenly did not own. Something in me hardened like cooling glass, and something else broke. I thought of my father teaching me in 1998 that a person is a collection of promises more than any name. He said this while changing a tire on a warm night in Recife when the air smelled like salt and mango and motor oil. We had been visiting cousins I no longer speak to, and he told me if a person keeps their promises, you can survive the rest. I had measured my husband by promises kept and broken. Trash taken out, calls returned, whispers of another shift accepted so we could buy a secondhand sofa for $80. Now I stood in a room where none of the names matched, and the promises were suddenly suspect. I pressed my palms together in a silent prayer for the kind of clarity that shows up with a clean white light and a figure who says, "Here is what the next hour will be." There was no light. There was only a buzzing ceiling and the soft weight of a choice moving toward me like a tide. I picked up one of the green apples from the gift shop bag and placed it on the tray table. He had always said green apples taste like mornings, crisp and honest. He looked at it as if remembering a line from a story he once told and no longer believed. I stayed in that hospital room long enough for the fluorescent light to buzz itself into my memory forever. Every sound in that space had weight now. The rattle of the IV pole, the squeak of the nurse's sneakers, the steady whistle of oxygen as if the walls themselves were breathing in disbelief. My husband, or the man I thought was my husband, lay between two lives, and I was standing at the border with no map. The woman and her children waited at the threshold, not moving closer, not moving away. I wanted to scream at them to leave, to give me time, to stop pressing the truth into the corners of my chest where I could no longer breathe. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because the boy's eyes looked exactly like his. Exactly like the eyes I had searched for in crowds at Port Authority. The eyes that had calmed me when I thought I might lose my job. The eyes that had once convinced me everything could be rebuilt if we just held on a little longer. That night, when the nurses made me leave, I walked into the parking garage with my keys pressed into my palm so hard that half-moon marks rose on my skin. The Civic was still in C27, smelling faintly of damp carpet, and the takeout containers I had never gotten around to throwing away. I sat there with the engine off, listening to the echo of tires on concrete, and tried to remember every moment that could now be a lie. The road trip to Maryland in 2013, where he insisted on stopping at every diner with neon signs. The story he told about his father teaching him to fish in a lake outside Cleveland. The way he refused to celebrate Thanksgiving in 2016, saying the holiday didn't matter, and I told myself it was just his work schedule. Were these pieces of him, or pieces of someone else's shadow? I thought of the rent receipts, the medical bills, the boxes of photographs, and felt an old kind of fear, The kind I had not known since I was a girl watching my mother hide coins in an envelope behind the flour jar so my father wouldn't drink them away. The fear of everything slipping through your fingers, not because you lost it, but because it was never really yours. 2 days later, the hospital called me back for a family meeting. The word tasted wrong in my mouth. Family. The conference room was too cold, the blinds drawn halfway. A social worker with kind but tired eyes sat across from us. Me on one side, her on the other. The children sat quietly, the girl sketching again, the boy staring at his shoes. And between us, the man we both claimed, though he didn't claim either of us. He spoke in short sentences, like a man learning a language he had once known and forgotten. He admitted he had lived as Lucas for more than a decade. He admitted he had built a life in New York with me and kept the other life buried under excuses, half-truths, silences. He said he didn't know how to explain. He said after the accident in 2016, after the hospital mix-up, he realized he could start over. He told himself the old life was gone, that he was free to create something new. I listened and wanted to reach across the table and slap him, shake him, demand that he say my name with conviction, but all I could do was press my hands together until the bones hurt. The social worker asked me what I wanted. I laughed, a short, broken laugh that tasted like salt. What I wanted was impossible. I wanted to go back to the day in February 2011, back to the spilled coffee lid and the smile that fooled me into believing. I wanted to stand on the boardwalk in Coney Island with our pockets empty, but our hearts convinced of the future. I wanted to erase this woman across from me, this mirror of everything I thought was mine. But wanting doesn't make the truth any softer. I said I wanted answers. He said answers would not fix anything. I asked him if he loved me, even once. He looked at his hands and said nothing. Silence can be the loudest confession. That week I stopped going to work. My boss called twice, left messages that grew sharper, but I couldn't face the pharmacy shelves, the constant questions of strangers about dosages and refills when my own life was a dosage that no longer matched the prescription. I stayed home, sitting at the kitchen table where the sunlight hit the chipped linoleum at 3:15 every afternoon, staring at the envelope of savings. I counted it twice a day, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into a different reality. 2,730. Enough to leave, not enough to rebuild. My phone buzzed with calls from the hospital, from him, from the woman. I let them go to voicemail. At night I opened our photo albums, the ones we had never digitized. I studied every angle of his face, every smile, every shadow. Was he Lucas there? Or Daniel? Did it matter? Or had I been building a life with a ghost all along? The letter came in the mail on a Thursday. A formal envelope. The hospital's letterhead. Inside, words about insurance, identity verification, the need for legal counsel. At the bottom, a note handwritten in the margin. I am sorry. His handwriting. The same loops and curves that had signed our rent checks, that had scrawled quick I love you notes on scraps of paper tucked into my lunch bag. I held that note until the ink smudged against my palm. Sorry was not enough. Sorry was a wound dressed with tissue paper. The hardest part was the neighbors. Mrs. Rivera from 4B knocked one evening with a container of arroz con leche and asked why Lucas wasn't home. I smiled tightly, said he was still in the hospital, and watched her kind eyes soften with sympathy that felt like a betrayal, because she believed the name, because she believed the story. And I was beginning to wonder if I had been the only one who didn't see through him. One night, unable to sleep, I walked to the corner bodega and bought a pack of gum, not because I needed it, but because I needed the transaction, the exchange of coins for something real. The man behind the counter said, "Haven't seen your husband in a while. Everything okay?" I nodded, too quickly, and felt the world tilt again. Everyone knew him. Everyone knew Lucas. But no one knew Daniel. Except me, now. Except the woman and her children. And what do you do with a man split into two? Do you fight for him? Do you let him go? Do you pretend one version was the only version that ever mattered? I walked back past the shuttered storefronts, the flicker of a broken streetlight, and thought of every sacrifice I had made in those years. Every hour of overtime, every meal skipped to save $1, every smile forced when all I wanted was sleep. I thought of the manipulation, the lies that must have been crafted with care, and I felt the slow burn of rage rise under my skin. It wasn't just about love, it was about time, about the years that could never be returned, about the pieces of myself I had given freely to a man who never truly existed in the way I believed. And yet, deep inside, a question lingered. If he wasn't who I thought he was, then who was I during those years? Was I still the woman who loved him? Or was I just a placeholder in someone else's unfinished story? The morning after that sleepless night, I walked into the hospital with the same determination that had once carried me through 12-hour shifts at the pharmacy. The security guard at the front desk nodded, unaware that the woman walking past him was balancing between two lives. The halls smelled of bleach and old coffee, and every step echoed against the tiled floor like a verdict. I told myself I needed clarity, not more confusion. I needed to look him in the eye, to hear him speak with the voice I had trusted for 14 years, and decide if there was anything left to hold on to. He was sitting upright this time, the hospital gown loose around his shoulders. His face looked thinner than I remembered, older, as if the truth itself had aged him overnight. When I stepped inside, he didn't smile. He just said my name softly, and that was enough to reopen every wound. I sat in the chair and laid my bag at my feet, hands folded tight on my lap. I asked him when he was going to tell me. He said he thought about it 1,000 times. He said every anniversary, every Christmas, every birthday that wasn't really his. He told himself this was the moment. But then he looked at me, at the life we had built, and he couldn't destroy it with words. I reminded him he destroyed it anyway. He lowered his eyes. He said he thought he was protecting me. Protecting me from what? From reality? From the knowledge that I was living with a man who belonged to someone else? I pressed him harder. I asked about the accident in 2016, about the hospital in Ohio. He told me he had been in the car with a friend, drunk, the night splitting open with headlights and metal. He woke up in a rural clinic with no memory of how he got there, no ID, no answers. The other man, he said, hadn't made it. He was told later the records were confused, that his name didn't matter, that he could walk away as someone else. He admitted he didn't fight it. He said it felt like a second chance, a way to erase debts, failures, shadows he hadn't told me about. I asked him what shadows. He wouldn't say. His silence told me there were more lies, more layers I would never peel back. The anger rose like fire in my throat. 14 years of sacrifice, of holding us together, of swallowing doubts because I believed in us. I reminded him of the years we lived paycheck to paycheck, when I worked double shifts and he promised me it was for a future. I reminded him of the days we couldn't afford heat, when we slept in jackets and shared the warmth of a single space heater. I reminded him of every coin I counted, every meal I stretched, every dream I deferred. And he had let me do it all for a man who didn't even exist. He had let me pour my life into a ghost. My voice cracked when I asked if he ever felt guilty. He said every single day. But guilt, I told him, isn't the same as love. That afternoon, I saw her again. The other woman. She was waiting in the corridor, her cardigan wrinkled now, her eyes tired but steady. She didn't glare at me, didn't accuse me. She just said, "I thought he was dead. I thought I was burying my husband. And now you stand here telling me you've lived with him for 14 years. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled. I wanted to scream, to fight. But instead I asked her what she wanted from me. She said nothing. She said she just wanted the truth acknowledged, wanted her children to know their father hadn't abandoned them. Her son clung to her arm, his small face buried in her sleeve. Her daughter looked at me with wide, unblinking eyes, as if memorizing the rival who had unknowingly shared her father. That night, I sat alone in our apartment, staring at the walls we had painted together, the furniture we had saved for piece by piece. I thought of the impossible request hanging over me now, to let him return to them, to release him, to accept that my years were built on a lie, and to surrender the man I loved to a family that had been waiting in grief. I wanted to hold on, but what would I be holding on to? A name that wasn't real? A promise that never belonged to me? I traced the rim of my coffee mug with my finger and thought of all the women who had built lives on sand without ever knowing until the tide came. I had become one of them. And now I had to choose whether to keep drowning in the undertow of lies or swim toward a shore that might not even exist. The hardest part was the question that never left my mind. If I let him go, what does that make me? A victim? A fool? Or just a woman who finally woke up from a dream that lasted too long? The following week was a blur of paperwork and phone calls, the kind of endless administrative noise that drowns out whatever is left of a broken heart. The hospital's legal department called me twice a day, asking for documents, proof of insurance, signatures that would decide under which name he would be discharged. I sat at the kitchen table with the blue folder that held our life, marriage certificate, lease agreements, tax returns, and felt as if every page turned to dust in my hands. Each line of ink was suddenly questionable, as if I had been married to an illusion that had somehow learned to forge a life as neatly as a signature. One morning, I opened the shoebox under our bed and counted the money again. $2,730. It wasn't just savings anymore. It had become my only anchor. Every dollar smelled of the sacrifices I had made. The lunches skipped, the holidays ignored, the nights worked instead of slept. I pressed the bills to my chest and asked myself if I should run, change the locks, pack what I could fit into 2 suitcases and disappear before the truth crushed me completely. But running felt like admitting I had been nothing more than collateral damage in someone else's mistake. He called me that afternoon, his voice thin through the hospital line. He said my name, the name he had said 1,000 times, and begged me to visit. Against my better judgment, I went. He was sitting up straighter now, color returning to his face, though not enough to erase the hollowness in his eyes. He said he never wanted to hurt me. He said when he chose the name Lucas, he thought he was burying a past that could only destroy him. He told me he loved me. He repeated it like a man clinging to a lifeline, but every repetition sounded like it belonged to someone else's story. I asked him about her, about the woman in the cardigan, about the children with his eyes. He said her name quietly, as if it were forbidden, and I felt the syllables cut into me like glass. He admitted they had been married for 9 years before the accident, that their house in Akron had a front porch with peeling paint, that she loved chamomile tea, that the kids still asked for bedtime stories he never returned to tell. He didn't look at me when he said it. I realized then that love can be multiplied, divided, even faked. But family leaves marks you cannot erase, no matter how many names you change. The social worker called another meeting. This time, lawyers were present, folders thick with papers that carried more authority than any vow I had spoken in church. They explained the situation as if it were simple: legal identity, medical records, marital rights. But there was nothing simple about asking me to recognize that the man I had built my life around belonged by law and by blood to someone else. I stared at the stack of documents and thought of the years I had given him. 14 years. Rent money scraped together. Electricity kept on by counting coins. Hospital visits. Birthdays. Nights of shared silence that felt like safety. Could all of that be erased by a few signatures? He reached for my hand in the middle of the meeting. His palm was warm, familiar. My body remembered the comfort even as my mind screamed betrayal. I pulled away. I told the room that I wasn't ready to decide. One of the lawyers adjusted his glasses and said time was not on my side. The other family was ready to reclaim him. I felt the word reclaim sink into me, as if I had been nothing more than a borrower, a placeholder until the rightful owners returned. That night, I couldn't eat. I sat on the couch with the green apple from the hospital tray, the one I had carried home as if it might explain something. I turned it over in my hand and thought of every time he had said he liked them crisp, honest, like mornings. I bit into it and tasted only bitterness. I realized then that the real betrayal wasn't just the lies he told. It was the years I had been manipulated into building a life that never belonged to me. He let me sacrifice. He let me struggle. He let me believe. And when the truth came, he expected me to understand, to forgive, to share. I whispered to the empty room, "What about me?" What about the years I can't get back? And the silence that answered felt heavier than any words he could have spoken. The days that followed felt like walking through fog with weights tied to my ankles. I went to the hospital less, not because I didn't care, but because I no longer knew what caring even meant. The nurses stopped asking me questions, stopped giving me updates. Their eyes lingered on me with the kind of pity reserved for someone who has been replaced but hasn't yet realized she's already gone. One evening when I did visit, I found her sitting by his bed, her hand resting on his arm with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. The children were coloring quietly in the corner, as if the room belonged to them. And maybe it did. I stood there for a full minute before anyone noticed me. When he finally looked up, his face betrayed a flicker of guilt, but he didn't move her hand away. That was the moment I understood. I had been slowly erased from a story I thought I was writing. I walked out without saying a word, my heart thundering in my ears. On the subway ride home, I stared at the reflection in the window, the blurred city lights framing a woman I barely recognized. My shoulders slumped, my eyes hollow, my mouth tight with words unsaid. I thought of the years of manipulation, subtle, carefully constructed lies that had bent my reality until I couldn't tell truth from fiction. Every late-night phone call he took in the hallway, every story about working overtime that didn't quite add up. Every time I told myself trust is stronger than doubt. I had been manipulated into silence, trained to dismiss my instincts in the name of love. 2 days later, the impossible request arrived. She called me directly. Her voice was steady, almost kind, which somehow made it worse. She said, "I'm not asking you to give him up. I'm asking you to let him be who he truly is." She told me the children needed their father. She told me she had forgiven the years he was gone, that all she wanted now was to rebuild what had been broken. She didn't scream, didn't accuse. She simply asked me to release him, to step aside, as if I were holding on to something that had never been mine. I hung up the phone and sat on the floor of the kitchen, the cold tiles pressing into my skin. The request echoed through me, impossible to ignore. That night, I opened the albums again. I studied every photo like evidence in a trial. His smile at Coney Island, his hand around mine at Niagara Falls, his tired face after a long shift when I pressed a plate of reheated pasta into his hands. Were these memories real? Or were they performances, practiced lies to keep me believing? I wanted to find one picture where I could say with certainty, this was us, this was true. But each image blurred into doubt, every smile carrying a shadow I hadn't noticed before. Sleep became impossible. I wandered the apartment at night, touching the objects that had defined our life, the dented coffee pot we bought at a yard sale for $5, the second-hand sofa that had cost us $80, the framed picture from our wedding, where he wore a borrowed suit and I wore hope-like armor. Each item whispered back at me, none of this was built on the foundation you thought. And then, one evening, the lie cracked open in a way I hadn't expected. I found an envelope at the bottom of his old work bag, buried under receipts and crumpled papers. Inside was a pay stub from 2018, not from the loading dock where he claimed to work, but from a construction company in Ohio, a company based in the same town she had said they lived in before the accident. My breath caught. He hadn't cut ties completely. For years, even while living with me, he had been earning money under his other name. I realized then that the manipulation had gone deeper than I imagined. It wasn't just that he chose silence. It was that he had maintained both lives in fragments, weaving lies with the precision of a craftsman. I sat at the table with the stub in my hand, shaking, my chest heavy with betrayal. For years I thought we were scraping by, sacrificing together. But the truth was, he had been funneling pieces of himself elsewhere, leaving me to carry burdens he could have shared. The rage inside me was sharp enough to cut. My sacrifices, my endless belief in us, had been built on a foundation of deception. And now the request to let him go wasn't just impossible. It felt like the final twist of a knife that had been sliding into me for years. The discovery of that pay stub was the crack that made everything collapse. I laid it on the kitchen table under the dim light, next to our unpaid gas bill and the envelope of savings. and I stared at it until the numbers blurred into lines. All the sacrifices I had made, the meals skipped, the double shifts endured, the holidays spent counting pennies, they weren't for us. They were for a ghost, a man who had been building safety nets in two worlds while I drowned in one. My chest burned with humiliation. I wanted to scream into the walls, to rip down the photographs, to smash the coffee pot just to hear something break outside of me. The next morning, I carried the pay stub to the hospital. I didn't plan what I would say. The anger carried me like a current. When I walked into his room, she was there again, seated quietly at his side, the children sketching at the little table the nurses had set up for them. I didn't care. I held the paper in front of him and demanded answers. He froze, his eyes widening in recognition. His mouth opened and closed without sound. She leaned forward, confused, asking what it was. I told her. I told her he had been paid by a company in Ohio while living with me, that he had never really severed ties with her life. Her face drained of color, but her expression didn't harden toward me. It hardened toward him. He whispered that he had kept the job to send money back, that he couldn't cut everything off, that he had wanted to provide for them even when he wasn't there. The words stung like acid. Provide for them? I asked, my voice cracking in front of strangers. What about me? What about the rent I carried on my shoulders, the bills I paid in coins, the years I lost sleep wondering if we would be evicted? He didn't answer. His silence was a confession louder than any explanation. The boy looked up from his coloring, his eyes wide with fear. The girl wrapped an arm around him, and for a moment, the sight of their small bodies absorbing this ugliness twisted the rage into something heavier. Grief. None of this was their fault. They hadn't chosen to be part of a lie, just as I hadn't. We were all victims of a man who thought he could rewrite his life by erasing names and switching faces. I left the room before the tears could spill. In the hallway, I leaned against the cold wall and tried to steady my breathing. The hospital's intercom buzzed overhead, announcing visiting hours were nearly over, and I realized how absurd it all was. That my world was ending in a place where people came and went every day with flowers and balloons, where lives were saved while mine was being dismantled. That night, I couldn't stay in the apartment. The walls felt too loud with memories. I walked until my feet ached, past shuttered shops and street vendors packing up their carts, until I reached the Hudson River. I stood at the railing, the water black and restless beneath the orange glow of the city, and asked myself a question I had avoided until then. Was I willing to keep fighting for a man who had lived two lives at my expense? Was I willing to keep being the shadow wife, the woman who sacrificed while another family waited in silence? The answer came quietly, not as a roar, but as a steady truth rising from somewhere deep inside me. I couldn't. I couldn't keep bleeding for a man who had already chosen who he really was. And even if he hadn't said it out loud, the pay stub told me everything I needed to know. His loyalty had never belonged fully to me. I walked home with that truth pressing against my ribs like a second heartbeat. For the first time in weeks, the fog in my mind lifted just enough to let in a sliver of clarity. My life wasn't over, but the life with him was. The next morning, I woke with a strange kind of stillness inside me. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was no longer the storm that had rattled my bones for weeks. I brewed coffee in silence, poured it into the chipped mug we had bought at a flea market for $1, and sat at the table where so many arguments, so many dreams had unfolded. The pay stub still lay there, its ink accusing me every time I looked at it. I didn't move it. I wanted to see it. I wanted to remember the exact moment when illusion finally turned into truth. That afternoon, the hospital called again. They said he was ready for discharge. Their tone was clinical, detached, but I could hear the weight behind their words. The question was simple. Under which name would he leave? Lucas, the man I had loved for 14 years? Or Daniel, the man who had a wife and children waiting to reclaim him? I sat in silence, the phone pressed to my ear, as if the right answer might materialize from the hum of the line. But there was no right answer. Only loss. Only betrayal. Only a choice between letting him walk out as the man who destroyed me or letting him return as the man who belonged to someone else. I decided to see him one last time before I gave any response. When I entered his room, he looked healthier, dressed in his own clothes again. A plain gray sweater, jeans, the same sneakers I had watched him lace up 1,000 times. But he didn't look like my husband anymore. He looked like a stranger wearing his face. She was there too, standing by the window with her cardigan pulled tight, the children quiet at her side. Their presence no longer startled me. It was almost expected, like actors who had finally taken their rightful place on stage while I stood behind the curtain. I asked to speak with him alone. She hesitated, then nodded, leading the children out into the hall. The door clicked shut, and the silence between us was unbearable. I asked him why he had let me sacrifice everything, why he had built a life with me while sending pieces of himself back to them. He said he didn't know how to stop. He said he loved me, but he also loved them. He said he thought he could live 2 lives without destroying either. His voice broke as he admitted it, but my chest felt hollow listening to him. Love, I realized, wasn't enough when it came dressed in lies. I told him about the nights I had gone hungry so he could eat, about the bills I had carried on my back, about the years I had worked until my hands ached while he kept secrets tucked into envelopes at the bottom of his bag. I told him love doesn't justify betrayal, and guilt doesn't erase the weight of manipulation. His eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing, not anger anymore, not sorrow, just emptiness. He reached for my hand. I let him touch me once more, felt the warmth of the skin I had known for so long, and then I pulled away. I told him the only truth I had left to give. I couldn't keep being the woman he lied to. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for a man who had already chosen another life, whether he admitted it or not. When I left the room, she looked at me, waiting. I handed her the pay stub without a word. Her hands trembled as she took it, and for the first time, I saw her eyes fill not with suspicion, but with understanding. We were 2 women caught in the orbit of the same man, both robbed of years, both forced into roles we hadn't chosen. She whispered, "Thank you," and I nodded. No more words were needed. That night, I sat in the apartment surrounded by the relics of a life that no longer existed. The sofa, the photos, the chipped mugs, all of it felt like props from a play that had ended. I opened the blue envelope of savings and spread the bills across the table. $2,730. It wasn't enough to erase the years, but it was enough to start something that belonged only to me. For the first time, the thought of leaving didn't terrify me. It felt like oxygen filling my lungs. I whispered to the quiet room, "I am not his mistake. I am my own beginning." The day of his discharge arrived with a gray sky that seemed to hang low over the city. I walked to the hospital slowly, every step deliberate, as though my body understood it was carrying me toward an ending I had no control over. The automatic doors opened with their usual hiss, but it felt different this time, like crossing a threshold between the life I had known and the life I was about to face. In the lobby, I saw them waiting, the woman in her rain-colored cardigan, the boy clinging to her hand, the girl clutching her sketchbook. Their eyes flickered toward me but didn't linger. They knew as well as I did that this wasn't my day anymore. When I entered his room, he was ready, dressed in the same gray sweater, a small duffel bag packed at his feet, discharge papers stacked neatly on the table. He looked at me with an expression that tried to be gentle, but it carried the weight of choices already made. I didn't sit down. I stood by the door and let my silence do the work. After a long moment, he said he never meant for it to end like this. I told him it had ended years ago, the first time he chose to lie. He lowered his eyes and nodded, as if he had finally stopped trying to defend the indefensible. The nurse came in with forms, asked me to confirm information, to sign as his spouse. My hand trembled holding the pen. The name on the page was Daniel, not Lucas. Signing it felt like signing myself out of existence. For 14 years, I had been Mrs. Lucas. In one stroke of ink, I was nothing but a footnote in his hidden history. I signed anyway, not for him, but for myself, to end the chapter that had already been torn apart. When the nurse left, I placed the pen on the table and told him this was the last time I would stand in a room with him. He tried to speak, but I raised my hand to stop him. I didn't need more apologies, more words that would only unravel in the air. I told him he had made his choice long before this moment, and now I was making mine. I turned to leave, but before I did, I whispered something only he could hear. You may have lived 2 lives, but I will not live half of one. In the hallway, they were waiting. The children's faces lit up when they saw him, and despite everything, I felt a hollow ache in my chest. He walked toward them, slow but steady, and the boy reached for his hand the way I used to. The girl smiled through tears, clutching her sketchbook like it was proof of a father returned. The woman looked at me, her expression unreadable, and I realized she didn't see me as the enemy anymore. She saw me as someone who had suffered alongside her, someone who had been manipulated into a role she never asked to play. I left before I could watch them walk out together. Outside, the rain had started, thin needles pricking my skin as I stood on the sidewalk. The city buzzed around me, indifferent to my grief, indifferent to my ending. I walked back to the apartment one last time. I opened the drawers, the closets, the shoebox under the bed. I packed only what was mine: clothes, the savings envelope, a few books, the photographs, the furniture, the chipped mugs. I left them all behind. They belonged to the ghost life of Lucas, not to the woman I was becoming. That night, I rented a small room in a boarding house on the other side of the city. The walls were bare, the bed creaked. The air smelled faintly of mildew, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like the space was truly mine. I sat on the mattress, spread the envelope of savings across the bedspread, and counted the bills again. $2,730. Enough for a new beginning. I thought of all the years I had lost, the sacrifices twisted by lies, the impossible requests I had endured. And then I thought of tomorrow, not with fear, but with a fragile sense of freedom. Tomorrow I could wake up without waiting for a key to turn in the lock, without bracing for secrets to unravel. Tomorrow, I would wake up as myself, not as someone else's mistake. For the first time since the doctor pulled me into that corner and told me my husband wasn't who I thought he was, I allowed myself to breathe without trembling. The first weeks on my own were brutal. Freedom doesn't taste sweet when it comes wrapped in silence and loneliness. The boarding house was filled with strangers, men who worked late shifts, women who whispered in languages I didn't understand, doors that slammed at odd hours. But none of it mattered because I was alone for the first time in 14 years. At night, I lay awake on that thin mattress, listening to the hum of the radiator and the muffled sounds of traffic outside. And I wondered who I was without him. Not his wife, not his partner, just me. The thought was terrifying, but it was also the beginning of something I hadn't felt in years: possibility. I started small. I went to the grocery store and bought only what I wanted, not what he liked. I made a list of the meals I had missed. Simple things, like tomato soup with too much basil, or pasta loaded with garlic because I never had to hear him complain about the smell. I ate sitting on the bed, the steam rising against my face, and I let myself cry between bites. Each tear was both grief and release, a reminder that healing isn't neat. Work was harder. Returning to the pharmacy meant facing coworkers who had known me as part of a couple who had asked about my husband in casual conversations. When they asked how he was doing, I lied. I said he was recovering. I couldn't explain the truth yet, that the man they thought they knew had never really existed, at least not in the way we believed. I smiled at customers, filled prescriptions, and went home to my bare room with my savings envelope tucked under the mattress. Every day felt like an act of survival. But slowly, moments of strength began to surface. I walked along the Hudson again, this time not to collapse, but to breathe. I noticed things I hadn't seen before: the way the water shimmered gold at sunset, the rhythm of joggers' feet on the pavement, the laughter of children who weren't weighed down by secrets. The city hadn't changed, but I had. It no longer felt like the backdrop of a lie. It felt like the stage of a life I might finally build on my own terms. And yet, the shadows followed me. Some nights, I dreamed of him calling me by the wrong name, slipping into another bed, another family, while I stood helpless on the outside. I woke drenched in sweat, clutching the sheets like they were the only truth left. Other nights, I dreamed of our early days, before the lies were visible, when laughter came easily and the future felt possible. Those dreams hurt most of all, because they reminded me that love, even counterfeit love, can leave real scars. One evening, I took out the old photo album I had brought with me. I forced myself to look at every page. Our wedding day, where I smiled so wide my cheeks hurt. Birthdays, trips, nights at home. I whispered to the woman in those pictures, "You didn't know. You couldn't have known." I refused to let shame define me anymore. His lies didn't erase the truth of my devotion. They didn't erase the years I gave with an honest heart. It was then that the reflection began. Not the kind that asks why this happened, but the kind that asks what comes next. I realized I couldn't keep measuring my life by what he took from me. If I did, I would remain trapped in his shadow forever. I had to start measuring by what I could still build. Trust in myself, a future unshackled from deceit, a story that belonged entirely to me. So I began writing it down. Every night after work, I filled pages of a notebook with memories, with pain, with the truths I had uncovered. Some entries were messy, ink smeared by tears. Others were sharp and precise, as if carving out a map toward who I was becoming. The more I wrote, the more I realized the manipulation had shaped me, but it had not destroyed me. I was still here, breathing, writing, surviving. And somewhere in that process, I understood something I had never dared to admit. Forgiveness wasn't about him. It was about me. It wasn't about excusing the lies or the years stolen. It was about releasing their grip on my future. I didn't know if I could forgive him fully, but I knew I could forgive myself for believing, for loving, for holding on too long. Months have passed since that day in the hospital, and though the scars are still fresh, I can feel myself changing. Pain doesn't vanish. It lingers, reshaping the way you move through the world, but it no longer dictates every breath. The boarding house was only the first step. I've since found a small apartment of my own, one bedroom with a window that faces the sunrise. It isn't much, but when the morning light spills across the floorboards, I remind myself that this space belongs only to me. No ghosts, no lies. Just me and the air I fought so hard to breathe freely. Sometimes, when I pass by St. Helena Memorial on my way to work, I feel the old weight pressing on my chest. I remember the doctor pulling me into that corner, his voice quiet as he shattered the life I thought I had. I remember her standing in the doorway, the children clinging to her side. I remember the boy's voice calling him Daddy, a word that pierced deeper than any blade. Those memories still hurt, but they no longer control me. They remind me of what I survived, of what I had the strength to walk away from. I've started rebuilding piece by piece. I opened a separate savings account with what was left from that envelope, and every paycheck I deposit a little more. Watching the numbers grow feels like reclaiming something that was stolen. I enrolled in evening classes at the community center, subjects I had always put aside because there was never time, never money. Now, even if I study by the glow of a dim lamp after long shifts, it feels like an investment in myself, not in someone else's secret life. There are moments when loneliness creeps in, when I catch myself reaching for the empty side of the bed or waiting for a voice that will never return. But I no longer see loneliness as a void. I see it as space. Space I can fill with new experiences, with friendships, with dreams that are finally mine. I've started volunteering at a shelter once a week, serving meals, listening to stories. It reminds me that betrayal may have broken me, but it did not harden me. I still have compassion to give, but now I give it with clearer eyes. I often wonder what became of them, of him, of her, of the children who once stood at the edge of my life. Sometimes I imagine them around a dinner table in Ohio, the boy laughing, the girl sketching, the woman smiling as though a wound has finally closed. I wonder if he tells them the truth now, or if he has woven new stories to replace the old ones. But then I stop myself. Their lives are no longer mine to watch. My gaze belongs forward, not backward. And yet, there are nights when his face returns in dreams. Not the liar, not the man caught between two names, but the man I believed in, the one who caught my coffee lid on a windy day in February, the one who laughed on the Coney Island boardwalk, the one who once held me when my mother died. That man never truly existed, but he mattered, because he shaped the woman I became. He forced me to learn that love without truth is only a mirage, and that survival sometimes means letting go of the person you thought you couldn't live without. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see someone different. Someone who has walked through fire and come out scarred but standing. Someone who knows that sacrifice should never be demanded through lies. Someone who understands that forgiveness is not for the betrayer but for the betrayed, a way to cut the chains of anger and step forward unbound. The final reflection is this: life will hand you betrayals you cannot imagine, manipulations you do not deserve, and losses that hollow you out. But within that hollow space lies the chance to rebuild. Not the same life, not the same love, but something truer. I no longer measure myself by the years I lost. I measure myself by the courage it took to leave, by the strength it takes to wake each morning and choose myself first. My husband returned from the hospital with another name and another family waiting for him, but I walked away with something he will never have again: the certainty that my future belongs only to me.